Half of my childhood home, the half my bedroom was in, was built in the 1800s and was originally a farmhouse. The house itself is on the very top of a steep hill, and the woods around it, which I often explored as a kid, had the original stone fences from the farmhouse, which in the broken bits I often found obsidian rock, known for spiritual protection, which isn't necessarily important to this story, but an interesting fact considering what I experienced as a kid there. The first paranormal events I remember happened when I was about 6. My sister and I still shared the same room. This room, which I'll just call the purple room as it was originally, although painted over a very deep dark purple. One night, my sister woke up me yelling. At first I was confused and tired until I heard what she was yelling about. Coming from the window was the sound of wet hands squeaking in an aggressive way or pattern. It wasn't raining, and the room's on the second floor away from the trees. It was too high for anyone to climb and make such a noise. So both petrified, we ran to tell our parents and have them check. But the noise stopped as soon as my dad came to check. So we went back to bed and not even 5 minutes later, it started again. And so we ran and had our dad check. And just as previously, it was silent. Nothing. This cycle happened one more time before we just slept downstairs. But whatever it was very strategic about its actions and who it wanted to present to. The second paranormal event happened shortly after my sister moved her bed to the room beside mine. In other words, it happened as soon as it was only me in the purple room. I was around 7 or 8, I think, and was crying whilst putting away my laundry. I can't quite recall the reason I was crying, but I remember it being something petty. Perhaps it was because I had to do laundry. Regardless, I suddenly stopped for no apparent reason, as I remember still feeling upset. But I stared blankly around the room. You know that blank stare you'd make as a kid trying not to cry while being scolded? It was that kind of blank stare. Anyways, I then looked up and saw a hooded old man. He was maybe 5'6", but only visible from the shoulders up. He was like a hologram in a way, see-through but extremely clear, and a white, slight pale bluish colour. I don't know if he emitted light, as it was broad daylight when this happened, but he was extremely detailed, and I could still remember the pores on his large nose and sagging cheeks. He had thin lips with deep smile lines, I think they're called, and his eyes weren't visible, but his eye bags were. His eyes themselves were covered by the hood he was wearing, and the hood itself was rounded and sat flat over his head and wasn't pointed or anything. He then just disappeared after a minute. I wasn't scared, but he just had a sour old man vibe, and once he disappeared, I just finished my laundry calmly and went back downstairs. After this sighting, I had named him Newman. Not sure where the name came from, but it felt specifically with an uppercase for whatever reason. After that, I started talking to him and them. I don't know where them came from, but yeah. Out loads about my day and random things. I found outside. He and them never talked back, but I could tell it was appreciated when I did. And the days I didn't, I felt someone waiting and would apologise and say I'd talk to you tomorrow. Around this age, maybe 8 or 9, my friend and I started using a spirit board at recess. This is what I think started the Shadow Man sightings. The spirit I knew wasn't Newman. Newman had a comforting feeling in his sternness. The spirit was just fear-inducing. It would lay under my bed in a way where its head would be visible from the shoulders up, and although it was just a black mass, you could distinguish its limbs and head and stuff. Anyways, it would stay in that position at night until I would spot it, and then it would rush underneath my bed in reverse. By that I mean its feet would rush to the head of the bed, so its shoulders and up were also under the bed, if that makes sense. But when it did this, It would make rushing, moving noises on the stuff underneath my bed. Garbage bags that stored stuffed animals that I rotated on my bed, and a hard plastic bin with winter blankets and clothes. It was a very distinct and disturbing sound and whoosh. This shadow man slash figure would also knock on the walls a lot. I have a video of these knocks on my old iPod somewhere, but these knocks had the same fear-inducing vibes and were not human either. This never went away, but the fear became manageable and the experiences lessened the less scared I was. It was during that same period when I saw a Newman for a second time. I was up late on my iPod and felt a presence to my right, which I feel like I should add that to my right was a wall my bed was pushed against. Anyways, so I looked to my right and there was a single eye, an old man's left eye, piercing back at me in an annoyed and frustrated expression, and was the same hologram hyper-realistic experience of the sighting I had of him before. It made me jolt, but I didn't feel threatened by it. Like before, just felt like I was being lectured, but it disappeared as quick as it came. After that, I turned my phone off and went to bed. I did tell my parents the next day, but I was ignored. These next two incidents happened when I was 12 to 13, and they happened outside of the purple room. And they're the only two that have happened in the house, outside of the room. Although they both still on the side that was built in the 1800s, which is strange. Anyways, the first incident, I was upstairs and home alone. I was in the purple room and heard papers being shuffled downstairs. Confused as I was home alone, I paused my music to get a better listen. But after I paused the music, the shuffling of the papers got louder and became aggressive, as if someone was throwing paper after paper in a fit, trying to look for something frantically or just annoyed at something. I then walked out of my room over to the top of the stairs to look down to see if I could see anything. The noises still continued, and I could now tell that the noise was coming from the right side of the staircase, which to the right is a home office area at the end of a hallway, and right beside the front door, which is important to the next story. Anyways, I still didn't see anything, but could still hear it, so I took a step down the stairs and it immediately stopped, as if it knew I was there. So then I ran back to my room and jammed the door shut till someone came home, but no one had broken in upon checking, so it was dismissed by my parents. The second incident, I was downstairs in the kitchen when I heard loud, aggressive knocks on the front door. The one beside the home office where I heard the papers. My sister was supposed to be dropped off by a friend that day, so I went over to the front door, figuring she was annoyed. I locked it and opened it and looked around on the screened porch, but she wasn't there. So I checked the door on the screened porch that leads to the outside, and it was locked, so I knew it wasn't her or a person, as it was a brick house and the porch was half brick, so no one could get into it without you hearing it or noticing a cut screen panel. So, freaked out and aware that it's not good to open a door for a spirit and let them into your home, especially not one that's knocking angrily, I went back to the front door that leads inside and said, "You're not allowed in, leave." Then I shut and locked the door again. I then returned to the kitchen, and immediately the door handle started violently shaking up and down, and the door was shaking as if someone was trying to push it. I went back and shouted, "Get out!" Kind of hopelessly, not gonna lie. But after that, it only continued for under a minute post, and then it stopped abruptly. For whatever reason, I felt like the paper shuffling in the door were related, as I got the same aggressive and frantic / annoyed feeling from them. The last two incidents that happened before I moved were both involving Newman. I was 15 or 16, and I hadn't had any contact with Newman in a while, and wasn't sure if he was still there or if it was just the more sinister spirits now. So home alone one day, I told him out loud I doubted his presence, but would still like to hear from him. I asked him that if he was still here, to move my desk chair. I told him he had 30 minutes and that I would go downstairs and would come up after 30 minutes. And so I did. And when I came back upstairs, the chair was in the centre of my room. Me thinking I might have misplaced the chair in the centre instead of the desk, then asked him to move it again back to my desk to confirm it was him. And again, I gave him 30 minutes. And when I came back upstairs, it was back at the desk where I'd asked him to move it. Seeing it move the second time made me go as pale as a ghost. The chair, although small and with wheels, was an old chair, so it was pretty heavy at the base. I was never able to lift it more than 2 feet. After that, I just said thank you and that I received the sign, but it was still just shaken. The last incident was the same sighting of his left eye, but this time to the right side of my bed, and up higher than my eye level and looking down. Not like it was before staring eye to eye. This time it also didn't make me jump, but I can't remember what I was doing before I just remember seeing him. Then him disappearing, then me turning off the light and going to bed. I grew up in Africa, where this story took place. At that time, I was 16 years old, and I was what is called a rebellious teenager. I'm 35 today. I would often go out late at night, stay with my friends until very late at night, and come home in the middle of the night. I lived in a house in a neighbourhood where there were no streetlights, because between the asphalt road and the house where I lived. To describe the neighbourhood a little bit, there was a road a little over 1 kilometre long that I had to walk to reach my house. And so there was no street lighting. It was almost very dark, especially on nights when there was no moonlight. I used to keep a small flashlight so that I could walk in the dark and get home. For the record, I know it may sound a little wild, but there were a lot of hyenas in my neighbourhood. But I have been told since I was a child that hyenas never attacked human beings. As scavengers, they would look for trash from houses to feed on. That night, as I came home once again in the middle of the night, I walked in the dark with my little flashlight to light the way. In the middle of the path, I felt that someone was following me. No footsteps or anything else suspicious, just a feeling without any real foundation. After a while, I started to get scared for no reason. The feeling of being followed in the middle of the night without seeing anything was really too strong. So I turned off my flashlight and continued walking in the dark, thinking that whoever was following me would not be able to follow me anymore. On the way, there was a very small bridge where there was a light, the only one on the way to my house. Before reaching the bridge, I hid on the lower side between 2 houses to see if the person following me would go over the bridge. I was a little paranoid, but I really thought that someone was behind me. What I saw still gives me the shivers when I think back. After 2 minutes maybe, I saw 2 shadows on that bridge, walking like human beings, but there was no one there. Just the 2 shadows. I still remember the shadows that were walking and that I saw clearly that night. The shadows were on the ground, but there were no bodies. Just the silhouettes on the ground walking as if someone were there, but no one was there. The 2 shadows were walking side by side and crossed to the bridge as normal people, except there was no one except the shadows. I had a fear that I still feel today after almost 20 years. I knocked like crazy at the door of the house next to where I was hiding. And after a few minutes, a man came out without understanding what was going on. He woke up in the night and I begged him to let me in. I think he knew who I was because I was a foreigner in the country, and in my neighbourhood, there weren't many foreigners. So he walked me home about 500 metres away from the place in question. I was shivering and woke up my mother, who started to pray. The next morning, I asked my mother about what I saw, and she told me not to worry, that these shadows were the shadows of sorcerers, and that apparently at night, that's how they move, invisibly. This is the only time I've experienced something that I can't explain to myself. I was still in high school at the time, and my grandmother often came to visit us at home. As usual, she often came to talk to my mother about things in general. I only remember that every Thursday she was holding with my mom a kind of coffee ceremony, which is very common in our culture. Surprisingly, I never asked myself this question before traveling abroad, but it's true that our coffee ceremonies, not only ours at home but in our country in general, are very much like a kind of religious ritual. We roast the coffee, we put a lot of incense so that the room is filled with smoke, and often we recite prayers. It's often said that it cleans or purifies the house. That day, I stayed with my grandmother and mother in the room where they were holding the coffee ceremony. I listened to them talk, and out of tiredness, I started to doze off, my head resting right next to my grandmother. After a while, my mother and grandmother stopped talking, and I felt that something was happening around me. I was wide awake, but I didn't want to show it. I don't know why, but I pretended I was still asleep. After a while, I heard my grandmother speaking, but it wasn't her. It was a very husky and masculine voice. For those who know grandmother, it's very strange. My grandmother, or whoever, had taken her place, greeted my mother, and my mother replied with a lot of respect, but above all, a lot of naturalness. At that time, I had problems with my tonsils, and my mother was very worried. She asked the spirit if I was going to recover from my tonsil problems, and the spirit told her not to worry, that everything would be fine. It's strange because my mother used to address my grandmother in the plural, as if she was talking to several people. She spent at least 20 minutes asking all sorts of questions, which my grandmother answered. The spirits possessing my grandmother finally warned my mother that my grandmother was not doing as they commanded, and that this was why she was in poor health. They told my mother that my grandmother must never miss the Thursday coffee ceremony once, and other stuff I forget, or she would have to pay the consequences. Her health, I guess. After 20 to 30 minutes, my grandmother came to her senses and asked my mother what they said. My mother told her that she had to follow what they told her to do in order to stay healthy. All the while, I was petrified and didn't want to show that I was awake. Back to me now. I was talking to my wife about this last night. I still say I don't believe in these stories in general, even though it's amazing that stories like skinwalkers are so prevalent in our culture. It was common knowledge that a neighbor turned into a hyena some nights, and many other stories about people you meet every day, but spend spun nights in the middle of wild animals, or people living with spirits, even with spirits manifesting themselves in front of you, etc. Finally, to conclude, I think what happens with the grandmother in question is a possession that we call Zar in our country. Basically, some people live with spirits inside them that give them orders in order to appease the spirits. For some spirits, it's to read Quranic or biblical verses every night. For others, it's to do a coffee ceremony every week. The most amazing thing about my wife's story is that it's completely integrated into the culture, and that people even seek advice from these spirits who possess people. By the way, the funny thing is that my mother is possessed by this type of spirit as well. For her, she also has to organize a coffee morning, but only once a year when she makes an animal sacrifice, usually sheep or chicken. And she is dressed entirely in red from dawn to dusk. I know it's super weird, but I come from a very traditional country. For us, it's totally normal. I'm not even sharing here the crazy things my mum would do or say about paranormal things. Don't hesitate to ask me questions. If you want to know more or tell me about what you know about this kind of phenomena, I'm super curious about your opinions. He had a really different taste of music ever since he was a kid. I mean, we would listen to teen pop, K-pop, classical jazz, There were plenty of music genres to listen to. Instead, he had a thing for orchestral music, opera, and instrumental. I don't know why, but he really loved to listen to those sad and creepy types of music. But he wasn't really into horror movies and supernatural stuff. He just loved it. His family and I sometimes made jokes of his weird taste, but we did all respect him. On his 11th birthday, his father gave him an old, tiny music box as a present. It's a circle-shaped music box with a thin lid. It's beautifully decorated with some type of decaying yellow metal. Bronze, maybe? You have to wind the heart-shaped metal blade to start the music playing. And if you closed the metal lid at the middle while the music was playing, it would also stop playing midway. The music is also cool and heartbreaking, maybe lasting around 2 or 3 minutes after each full wind. His father said that he got this from an antique store run by his friend with a really cheap price. He also added that the music box is said to be supposedly haunted. But we ignored that fact, as we were all skeptics who never experienced anything paranormal. So without any doubts, he loved it dearly. He wouldn't stop winding the music box even after thousands and thousands of times. We had to listen to it a million times non-stop. The music kept winding in our minds through the music boxes and playing. He valued that box so much that it occupied on the table beside his bed permanently. The activities began soon after a while of the arrival of this very music box. Though we believed the activities as mere accidents, we later figured out they were not normal at all, after we spoke up about his experiences years later. I will talk about 2 incidences. The first was his kid sister, who was 5 or 6 years old. She said she went to his room to find something when he was absent. He was probably out with me to play back then. And she knocked the music box accidentally over the desk and forgot to put it back in its place. Then she entered the living room to keep looking for something. She found it at the top of a shelf that was too tall for her to reach. So she took a chair, stepped over it and tried to reach it. But something collided with the chair, causing her to fall onto the ground. She kept crying and saying something knocked her chair, but we ended up to the conclusion that she was just unbalanced, which caused her to fall. I think she sprained her ankle and wasn't able to walk for a week. Next is me, who spoke badly about the music box. I was only joking though. I think I was at his home to help him with his homework that day. I already finished my job, so I sat on his bed while he was doing his homework. I felt kind of bored, so I picked up the music box, winding the metal blade and listened to the melody. Since I'm not a fan of this type of music, I laughed it off and said man, this melody is so boring, it's putting me to sleep. And I yawned, acting like I was sleepy. I said that just for fun, I swear. After that, I suddenly got the odd feeling when you're feeling like you're being stared at. He then finished his homework and asked me to check it. And when I touched the paper, the sharp edge of the paper got me bleeding. Not once, but twice in a mere minute. But we'd skipped thinking okay, that's possible. So we left it like it was nothing. Here's the main part of the story. One night after my friend was listening to his Carillon, he fell asleep putting the music box under his pillow. He said at midnight, a naked old woman with a long grey hair woke him up saying, "Boy, get up, you're crushing my head." He was shocked to see the old woman out of all doors and windows closed and wasn't unable to speak a word for a minute. She smiled at him and whispered, "Scared to see me?" He nodded his trembling head, gaining little of his control back. She said, "Don't worry, dear, I won't hurt you. I just want you to pull out my music box under your pillow." He gathered his courage and asked her who she was, as she put the box on the desk as gently as he could, and she answered, "Me? I'm just an old hag whom the music box belonged to." Now, The atmosphere was a bit warmer, and since she seemed no harm, they had a decent conversation. But the woman spoke most, and my friend just listened. And then he asked, "What can I do to help you?" The old lady walked towards the chair slowly, sat on it, and said, "You seem to love this box, boy." He nodded and said, "I love both the box and the music." The lady smiled again and said, "I'm happy to hear that, boy. And one question," she continued. "Will you protect this as you love it?" He said, "I will." The lady chuckled and said, "You do resemble him." She then stood up and walked towards him, handing over the music box gently into his palms and kissed his forehead with tears in her eyes. "You keep it then, boy." Those were her last words. He said after the kiss, he became dizzy and couldn't help but fall asleep gently as the old woman watched him. He had no idea who the woman was and only found himself hazy of what he experienced was true or just an illusion cast by his dreams. He opened it up after years in a holiday family reunion. Then, in the next few days, me, my friend, and his father went a bit checking to the antique store, a bit curious, and then to the locals where the music box was said to be originated from. Here, we discovered the past of the music box. I'll brief it to you. Before the Civil War broke out, a young and happy couple were married. One wedding gift was a cute, tiny music box, which is believed to be ours. They would listen to it every night, putting their arms around each other in the garden. They spent a normal and peaceful life before the Civil War started, and that's when the young man decided to join the revolution. The lady became concerned about him, but wasn't able to stop her determined husband. She was left with her parents. The poor lady did not have any children, but a younger sister. Little did she know, that was the last day she got to see him. The war took years as the lady waited for her lover faithfully, but no word returned to her even after the war had finally finished. She became so obsessed with the music box, listening and staring at it for days on end. She had less and less appetite, and so reached to a point where she just won't leave the music box alone in her bed. She would never answer to calls, weeping silently alongside her playing music box. So, the parents got used to the sad situation and just let their daughter be. One rainy day, when the mother of the lady knocked her door for dinner, no noise was heard. She became worried, so she screamed for her husband, and he kicked the door open, only to find the poor lady lying lifeless on her bed, alongside her open, yet now silent, music box. After her death, the box would be heard mysteriously playing, though never to be found playing whenever someone checked it. So, rumours popped out the box was haunted. Years later, the music box was sold to an antique shop owned by his father's friend. At the arrival of the music box, everything still seemed fine, but after some time, it became very old, so the owner kept it in a storeroom where we kept other old yet little priced sales. Ever since that night, the door of the storeroom would be heard banging at night. And when the owner's family fell asleep, they would hear a melody playing in their dream, and then the screaming of a woman screaming to let her go. The owner's family became so horrified, they decided to throw the music box away. Later that day, my friend's dad found it and asked the owner about its price. The owner just said, "Take it away." So that's how it ended up at my friend's house, I guess. It always gives me chills whenever we talked about the music box. By the way, the box is still in a good shape, but some certain notes cannot be played anymore. Dear lady, I hope you find your lover in the next life. So I've seen ghosts and shadow figures my whole life, and I might at some point write about those. This happened when I was living in North Hamilton as a 6 or 7-year-old. I just saw a TikTok about the Hat Man and had a rush of memories that I had totally forgotten about. Living in that house, I was always uncomfortable and would get this recurring dream of a tall man with a big grey beard and white eyes who would introduce himself as God and told me to stare into his eyes. He would then pull me into a hug, and it would feel like his embrace was fire burning me. Then I would wake up to find my room on fire. Until a few seconds later, I would actually wake up and everything would be fine. But I generally wouldn't be able to fall back asleep for the rest of the night. From what I remember, it was one of those nights where I woke up when I heard something outside my window. My window faced the backyard, but had a view of the driveway. And when I looked out to see what was out there, I saw a guy standing in the driveway in a top hat and coat. That was really all the details I could see since it was dark out. I was used to seeing shadows, but they wouldn't stay after I looked at them like this one. I felt this really deep dread, and just when I was about to get my parents, I blinked and he disappeared. Then a few nights later, I was getting into bed. I would sleep with my door open and the bathroom light down the hall on. I rolled into my right side and saw the same figure standing in my doorway, but this time it had a face similar to the ghost face killer from Scream. I of course didn't know anything about the Hatman or Scream at the time because I was young. I stared at it for a few seconds before pulling the covers over my head, but I could see the silhouettes through the blanket for a few seconds before it disappeared. I haven't been able to sleep with my door open since then. One night, I was playing in my room before bed. It was a stormy night, so all the windows were closed. My playroom was opposite my room down the hall. I heard a loud buzzing from the room, and when I looked at the dark room, it started glowing green before the desk chair in the playroom rolled across the room fast and slammed into the shelving unit, knocking things down. My mum came up the stairs and ran in there, expecting me to find breaking stuff. But I was in my room, cowering, and I told her what happened, but of course, she didn't believe me. From that point on, I was convinced that that's where the monsters slept at night. Those were the big events, but there was little stuff like hearing voices and footsteps. Let me know what you guys think. So basically, this took place 3 years ago in my old house. At this point in time, I was 13 years old and completely unconvinced about paranormal entities being real. For a little background, this story starts back just after we had moved into our new house. My dad had been offered a new job, and it was a great offer, so we'd moved to a new city. It was late in the evening, and both my parents weren't at the house. My mom was meeting with some friends, and my dad was on the evening shift at work, which meant I was home alone. It was probably just after 7 o'clock when my mom left the house, leaving me alone. I didn't really mind though, because I was looking forward to having the house to myself and just having the chance to hang out and watch TV on the big screen in our living room. For a little insight, the living room is on the main floor of my house. I have both a basement and an upstairs. I was just hanging out and watching some Netflix on the TV. I want to say maybe around 7:30ish, maybe a little later. I was just laying out on my couch, half asleep, as you do. For some reason, due to me being half asleep, I heard a creak from upstairs, one you would hear when someone's walking on hardwood. Now, I have a dog and a cat, so normally this wouldn't strike me odd. But this was an incredibly new house. It was built the year before we bought it, so it was very new. Everything was super sturdy and fresh, so the floors didn't creak at all. But alas, I just brushed it off like it was my dog or something. This was probably at least half an hour later, when I heard this weird click noise. I don't exactly know how to explain it. It was like the sound where you lock a door, but just louder. I couldn't pinpoint where I had heard it from. It sounded like it came from upstairs and downstairs. At this point, I got really paranoid. Not because I thought there was a ghost, but because this was a new house and I didn't know it well at all. So I decided to help calm my nerves. I would get on a FaceTime call with my friend. Nothing at all happened after I was on the call with them, which definitely made me feel better. I wasn't expecting both my parents to be home earlier than at least 12, and at this point it was probably 10ish. I was tired, so I just decided to go upstairs and get ready for bed. I took a quick shower and did all the normal stuff you do to get ready, brushing teeth, washing your face, etc. It only took me like 15 minutes, so I wanted to say it was only around 10:15. You're probably wondering why I keep bringing up the time. You'll figure it out later in this story. At this point, I was in bed, with no light in my room except for the light from my window. I don't know how long I'd been asleep, but I knew my parents were not home due to what happened later. When I woke up very suddenly, for some reason, it felt like how you wake up from a nightmare. You know, like the whole gasp, jolt up head thing. I didn't have a nightmare at all. It was strange. I felt cold, but not the type of physical cold, like the inside cold when you feel your stomach thumps. I kind of just sat up and looked around my room, trying to calm myself down. This is crucial, so you know it wasn't sleeping paralysis or anything of that sort. After glancing around my room a bit, something caught my eye. I looked over to the farthest corner of my room and could almost make out some sort of figure. It was completely horrifying. It was almost human, but it wasn't. It was tall, like seriously tall, maybe 8 feet. But it didn't have normal body proportions. It was so skinny, but its arms were long enough to reach its knees. This is gonna sound crazy, but the best way to describe it is almost like Slender Man, but shorter. I was so persistent that it wasn't paranormal, and maybe it was just something my clothes had made up. I don't know why I did what I did, but I lay down and tried to get back to sleep, despite my dripping feeling of dread. But I couldn't sleep at all. I lay there forever. I didn't feel safe, but I just lay there. I don't know how long had passed, but I heard my dad's car pull into the driveway, making me feel safer. Curiosity was killing me, so I pulled my head from under my covers to peek and see if it was still there, and it wasn't. The corner was empty and I felt better now. Nothing much happened after this. I tried telling my parents, but they told me my mind was playing tricks. I swear to God though, I saw that thing and it was real. I thought this would be the best place to share this. Maybe some people will believe me. My maternal grandparents lived in Nebo, Missouri, a little community in the Mark Twain National Forest. We lived in Springfield, making for a couple hours trip when we'd visit for holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day, sometimes 4th of July. And sometimes they'd have one of us kids visit for a few days. In 2006, my grandmother had a stroke and had to be put in a facility to monitor her state. The mental state never recovered, and the last photos of her I saw were nearly unrecognizable. All of us were preparing ourselves for the inevitable, that we'd have to say goodbye for the last time. Then, one Sunday morning, my father answered a phone call and shortly, the younger of my sisters started crying. When we asked what the problem was, she said, "Grandpa died." His health had suddenly broken down, and despite the attempt to get him medical attention, he'd gone quickly. That Wednesday, we had the funeral and burial. Given her physical and mental state, Grandma couldn't be there. In a couple days, we got the news that Grandma had died peacefully, and we had a second funeral and burial about a week after her husband. Now for the ghostly part. At the family meetings and such after the second funeral, a little story got out. Grandma had been informed that her husband had died, but on hearing this news, she protested that couldn't be, as he was still visiting her. Now, as I said, after the stroke, Grandma's mental state wasn't quite all there. But what if she was right? What if my grandfather was still visiting her? Did he not want to go without her? During my first 20 years, I never questioned that they loved each other. Maybe that love was enough to keep them together, even after one of them had already died.